Some of them walked in on their own 2 feet. Some were carried. Some were brought in the back of military vehicles with no windows, no explanation, and no idea where they were going. What they all had in common was this: none of them were supposed to talk about what happened next. Most of them were never supposed to leave. These are not the experiments you read about in school. These are the ones that were classified before the ink was dry. The ones where the researchers knew, from the very beginning, that survival was not part of the design. Where the question being asked was not, will this help people, but how much can a human body endure before it stops? This is the history they buried, and it is more real and more recent than most people are prepared to believe. To understand how experiments like these become possible, you have to understand something about the nature of war. Not the war you see in films, with its clear heroes and legible enemies. The real thing, the kind of war that hollows out the moral center of entire nations and replaces it with a single, overriding imperative: win, survive, dominate. That kind of war. The rules change. Not publicly. Publicly, the rules stay exactly where they are, enshrined in international agreements and military codes of conduct. But privately, in the classified memoranda and the whispered conversations between intelligence officers and government scientists, a different calculation is being made, one that begins with a simple, terrible question. What are we willing to do that the enemy is not? The answer, it turns out, is almost anything. The story begins in the 1940s, in multiple countries simultaneously, which is itself a disturbing fact. It was not one rogue nation or one deranged scientist who decided to use human beings as expendable research material. It was a pattern. Convergence. As if the pressure of global conflict had pushed multiple civilizations to the same dark conclusion at the same moment in history. In Germany, Nazi physicians are conducting experiments in the concentration camps that are so methodical, so carefully documented, that the records will later be used as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. In Japan, Unit 731 is operating in Manchuria with imperial sanction and military resources. In the United States, programs are being quietly authorized that will not become public knowledge for decades. The scale is different. The specific methods are different. But the underlying logic is the same. Certain human beings have been designated as outside the circle of moral consideration, and once that designation is made, once a person has been reclassified from subject to object, the only limit on what can be done to them is the imagination of the researcher.
You got it. The thing you spent months, maybe years, working toward: the job, the relationship, the number on the scale, the apartment, the recognition. The moment you told yourself, quietly but consistently, would finally make things feel different. And for a brief window, maybe hours, maybe a few days, something did feel different. And then it didn't. And what arrived in its place was not contentment. Not even neutral. Something that felt closer to empty. Like the finish line you crossed led directly into a field with no landmarks. And the worst part isn't the emptiness itself. The worst part is what the emptiness says to you. It says, maybe there is something wrong with you that success cannot fix. It says, maybe you are someone who will never actually feel okay. It says, maybe you don't deserve to feel good even when things are objectively good. And you sit with those conclusions because they feel in that hollow moment like they might be true. They are not true, but the emptiness is real. And it is telling you something specific, not about your worth, not about your capacity for happiness, but about a very particular way the human brain processes the future. Today we're going to look at exactly what that is. Because once you understand the mechanism, the emptiness stops feeling like evidence of something broken in you, and starts feeling like information about something you were never taught to see.
Begin. In the camps, because that is where the full horror of systematic human experimentation first becomes visible to the world. In the testimony and documentation that emerges from Nuremberg, at Dachau, prisoners are subjected to high-altitude experiments designed to benefit Luftwaffe pilots. The researchers need to know what happens to the human body at extreme altitudes. At what point does a person lose consciousness? At what point does the blood begin to boil? At what point does death become inevitable? To find out, they place prisoners in low-pressure chambers and reduce the atmospheric pressure until the effects they are studying begin to appear. The subjects are not anesthetized. The researchers want accurate physiological data, and anesthesia would compromise the results. So the men inside the chambers experience the full progression of hypoxia, the confusion, the convulsions, the hemorrhaging, the death, while doctors in white coats stand outside and record what they observe. Approximately 70 to 80 people die in the Darkio altitude experiments alone. At the same facility, freezing experiments are conducted to determine how long a human being can survive in cold water and what the most effective method of rewarming is. Prisoners are immersed in tanks of ice water, sometimes for hours. The core body temperature is measured as it drops. At some point, they lose consciousness. Some die in the water. Others are removed and subjected to various rewarming methods. Some are placed next to fires. Some are placed next to the bodies of other prisoners. Some are left in the sun. Some are given boiling water internally. The physician who oversees many of these experiments is a man named Sigmund Rat. He is not a marginal figure operating without oversight. He has the direct patronage of Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. His work is considered valuable. His data is considered important. After the war, his data is considered so important that there is a serious debate within the American medical and military establishment about whether to use it, whether knowledge gained through atrocity can be legitimately incorporated into legitimate science. That debate has never been fully resolved.
Let's stay with the experience for a moment, because it has a very specific shape that's worth naming accurately. This is not depression, necessarily, though it can coexist with depression. This is not ingratitude, though you'll probably accuse yourself of that. And this is not the absence of caring about the thing you achieved. You did care. You do care. The work was real. The wanting was genuine. This is something more disorienting than any of those things. It is the experience of arriving somewhere you have been picturing for a long time and finding that the picture and the place are completely different, not worse, necessarily. Just different in a way that the picture never prepared you for. The picture was luminous. It had a particular emotional quality, a sense of finally, of safety, of being seen, or settled, or enough. The reality is just Tuesday. The inbox is still full. The doubt is still present. The low-level hum of not quite okay that you assumed the achievement would silence is, if anything, more audible now that there's nothing left to pursue. And what this does to your relationship with yourself is significant, because you had a deal with yourself. An implicit contract that said, when I get this, I will allow myself to feel good, and you got it. And the feeling didn't come through. So now the contract feels void, and worse, it makes every future goal feel suspect. If that didn't work, what will? And underneath that question is a darker one that you may not even let yourself fully form. Is there something in me that simply cannot be satisfied? That question will sit at the back of everything until you understand what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is not a flaw in your character. It is a flaw in the map you are given for how feelings work. Here is the reframe that needs to come before the mechanism. You are not someone who cannot feel satisfied. You are someone who has been using achievement as a delivery system for an emotional state that achievement was never designed to deliver. That is not a moral failing. It is an extremely common cognitive error, one that is so embedded in the way most people are raised and educated that it barely registers as an error at all. We are taught in countless implicit and explicit ways that feelings are downstream of circumstances. That the sequence is achieve the thing, receive the feeling, get the job, feel secure. Find a relationship, feel loved. Reach the number, feel enough. But that sequence is neurologically backwards. And understanding why it's backwards, really understanding it, not just intellectually acknowledging it, is what changes the relationship to both achievement and to your own emotional life. Let's go into the mechanism. The psychological term for what you're experiencing is arrival fallacy. It was named and studied by the psychologist Tal Ben-Shahar, and it describes the consistent gap between the emotional outcome we anticipate from achieving a goal and the emotional outcome we actually experience upon reaching it. But to understand why arrival fallacy happens at a neurological level, we need to look at how the brain's reward system actually works. The brain has a predictive function. Before any significant event, an interview, a date, a moment of recognition, the arrival of something long wanted, the brain generates an anticipated emotional simulation. It constructs a felt sense of what that moment will be like. And that simulation is almost always more emotionally vivid, more complete, more satisfying than the real experience turns out to be. Why? Because the simulation is generated by imagination, which has no constraints. The imagined moment contains only the elements that feel good. The relief, the recognition, the sense of arrival. It edits out the ordinary details. The way your back still hurts. The email notification that arrives 5 minutes after the good news. The way your mind almost immediately begins scanning for the next problem to solve. The real moment contains all of those things.
Move to Auschwitz, to a name that has become, in the decades since, almost a symbol rather than a person. But he was a person. A physician, a man who had trained at some of Europe's most prestigious medical institutions. Joseph Mengele arrives at Auschwitz-Birkenau in May 1943. He is 32 years old. He is described by survivors as charming, well-dressed, sometimes whistling as he works. He becomes known as the Angel of Death, though that phrase, however apt, perhaps makes him sound more supernatural than he was. He was not supernatural. He was a doctor who had decided that the people arriving on the trains at Auschwitz were not people in any morally meaningful sense, and that their bodies were therefore available to him. Mengele's particular obsession is twins. He believes that studying identical twins will unlock the secrets of heredity, of genetic destiny, of the mechanisms by which physical and psychological traits are transmitted from generation to generation. When transports arrive at Auschwitz, he personally walks the platform, selecting twins from among the new arrivals. Children, primarily. He calls them his children. He gives them extra food, Oma times candy, and then he experiments on them. The experiments are varied and systematic. He injects dye directly into the eyes of living subjects, trying to change their color, causing blindness and excruciating pain. He performs surgeries without anesthesia to observe pain responses. He injects one twin with a disease, and then, when they die, kills the other twin so that simultaneous autopsies can be performed to compare the pathological effects. He attempts to surgically create conjoined twins by connecting blood vessels and organs, a procedure that results in gangrene and death. Of the roughly 1,000 twins Mengele examines at Auschwitz, approximately 200 survive the war. They are the ones who are still alive when Soviet forces liberate the camp in January 1945. Carry what was done to them in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Some spend decades searching for other survivors, trying to piece together what exactly was done to them and why. Mengele himself escapes to South America after the war. He lives in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil under various assumed names. He is never captured. He dies in 1979, drowning while swimming off the coast of Brazil. He is buried under a false name. His remains are identified by forensic analysis in 1985, 6 years after his death. He lives 34 years after the liberation of Auschwitz. 34 years of ordinary life, morning coffee, evening meals, conversations with neighbors, while the people he experimented on carry his work in their damaged bodies.
Here's the mental model that holds this most clearly. Imagine you've been walking through a long, dimly lit corridor. At the far end, there is a door. And behind the door, you have decided, not consciously but deeply, is a room where everything feels different, where the particular quality of not yet enoughness that has followed you through the corridor finally dissolves, where you get to stop. You walk the whole corridor, you reach the door, you open it, and it's just another room, well lit, perhaps genuinely better than the corridor, real in its own right. But the transformation you were expecting, the shift in the fundamental quality of your inner experience, that didn't happen. Because it was never on the other side of the door. It was never location dependent at all. The brain had constructed a simulation in which the destination solved something the destination was never capable of solving. And the gap between that simulation and the reality is what you experience as emptiness. There is a second layer to this that matters. The anticipatory state itself, the wanting, the working toward. The sense of meaning that comes from pursuing something generates its own neurochemical reward. Dopamine, again. But here specifically in its role as the motivation chemical. The state of moving toward a goal produces a sustained low-level dopamine activation that feels like purpose, like aliveness, like the sense that things are moving in the right direction. Arrival ends that state. The goal is achieved. The dopamine activation drops. The sense of forward motion, which was its own form of feeling good, disappears. And what remains, for a period whose length varies from person to person, is not the imagined reward. It is the withdrawal of the anticipation that had been sustaining you. You are not empty because you got what you wanted. You are empty because the process of wanting it was doing more emotional work for you than you realized. So what actually changes this relationship, to goals, to achievement, to the emotional life that exists beneath both? Not setting smaller goals, not lowering expectations, not some version of just be present that floats above the actual mechanism without engaging it. Here is the framework that works with the brain rather than against it. The first step is naming the real emotional target. Every goal you have pursued that carried this quality, this sense that achieving it would finally deliver something, was a proxy for a specific emotional state that you wanted to inhabit. And that emotional state has a name that is more precise than happy or successful. For some people it is safe. For others, enough. For others, seen, settled, free, worthy of rest. The practice here is to take the goal you just achieved, or the one you are currently pursuing, and ask, if this works exactly as I'm imagining, how will I feel? And then ask, what would that feeling actually give me? And then ask, where in my life do I already have access to even a small version of that? The brain's reward system can be redirected from future-oriented anticipation to present-moment recognition, but only if the present-moment experience is clearly linked to the emotional state the brain has been pursuing. This is not gratitude practice in the generic sense. It is a very specific cognitive act of connecting the emotional target to evidence that already exists.
Cross the Pacific. Because the story does not belong only to Europe. Unit 731 is not a rogue operation. It is a division of the Imperial Japanese Army, established in the early 1930s and operating continuously until Japan's surrender in August 1945. At its headquarters in Pingfang near the city of Harbin in occupied Manchuria, it employs at its peak over 3,000 personnel: doctors, scientists, laboratory technicians, support staff. Its commander, Lieutenant General Sher Ishii, is a physician and a visionary in the most disturbing sense of that word. He believes Japan's military future depends on biological and chemical weapons, and he understands that developing such weapons requires testing them on living human subjects. He creates the infrastructure to do exactly that. The prisoners who enter Unit 731's facilities are classified, as mentioned, as Maruta logs. The term is used openly. It appears in official communications. It reflects a complete and institutionalized dehumanization. These are not people who have been temporarily stripped of their humanity by one unhinged reason. They are material, officially reclassified by the apparatus of a nation. What is done to them inside the facility is almost beyond the capacity of a single documentary narration to fully convey. Prisoners are infected with plague bacteria, delivered through flea bites, through contaminated food and water, through direct injection. They are observed as the disease progresses through its stages, and when they die, they are autopsied to document the pathological effects. Prisoners are infected with cholera, typhoid, anthrax, tuberculosis, and other diseases in the same systematic way. But Unit 731 is not only about biological weapons. It is about understanding the limits of human physiology under extreme conditions. Prisoners are subjected to frostbite experiments in which limbs are deliberately frozen to study tissue necrosis. They are placed in pressure chambers. They are subjected to lethal doses of X-ray radiation, carefully graduated to observe the progression of radiation sickness. They are deprived of specific nutrients in controlled starvation experiments. They are subjected to high-voltage electric shocks of precisely measured intensity. All of this is documented carefully. The researchers of Unit 731 are not operating in chaos. They are doing science, at least by their own understanding of that word. They keep records. They write papers. They present their findings internally. And when the war ends, those findings become a bargaining chip. The American military arrives in Japan with an urgent interest in biological warfare research. The Soviet Union is advancing. The Cold War is beginning. The data that Unit 731 has collected at the cost of thousands of lives represents years of research that American scientists would otherwise need to conduct themselves. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing the American occupation of Japan, negotiates directly with Shuichisi. The terms are straightforward. Full immunity from war crimes prosecution for Ishii and all Unit 731 personnel, in exchange for complete access to all research data. Ishii agrees. The data is transferred. The immunity is granted. None of the researchers of Unit 731 are ever tried for war crimes. Many return to successful careers in Japanese society. Medicine, academia, industry, government. One becomes the governor of Tokyo. One founds a pharmaceutical company that still exists today. Shirashia dies in 1959 of throat cancer in his own bed at home.
A real-life example. Someone who has spent 2 years pursuing a promotion finally receives it and feels the familiar emptiness within a week. They sit down and ask, "What did I think this would give me?" The answer, honest and a little uncomfortable, "I thought it would mean I was finally good enough." And then, where in my life do I already have evidence that I'm good enough? The list is short at first, then longer. The brain begins to update the belief through present evidence rather than future projection. And the goalpost stops moving because it is no longer carrying the weight of an unresolved identity question. The second step is building process investment rather than outcome investment. The dopamine activation that sustained you through the pursuit of the goal was not attached to the outcome. It was attached to the process, the daily movement, the incremental progress, the sense of agency that comes from working towards something. The brain can be taught to locate the reward in the process itself rather than in the moment of arrival. But this requires a deliberate reorientation that most people never make, because the culture around achievement consistently points toward the outcome as the site of meaning. The practice is to identify within your current pursuit what you would continue doing even if the outcome were guaranteed to be exactly average. Not what you tolerate in service of the goal. What you actually find engaging in the process itself. This is where sustainable motivation lives, not in the imagined destination, but in the genuine interest that the journey activates. A real-life example. Someone writing their first book who is oriented entirely toward publication, the imagined validation, the proof of worth, is running on a fuel source that will exhaust itself at the moment of arrival. Someone writing because the act of finding the right sentence produces a genuine, present-tense satisfaction is running on a fuel source that the outcome cannot deplete. The work is the same. The neurological experience is entirely different. The third step is completing the arrival rather than rushing past it. One of the quieter contributors to arrival fallacy is that most people do not actually allow themselves to fully arrive. The achievement happens. And within hours, sometimes minutes, the mind has already moved to what's next. What needs to be done now? What could have gone better? What the next goal should be. The moment of arrival is never inhabited, which means the brain never gets to fully process and store it as a completed reward. The practice is simple and requires very little time. When something you worked for is achieved, any scale, not just the large ones, pause deliberately, not to perform gratitude, not to make it mean more than it does, just to let the brain's completion systems actually register that the loop has closed. This is neurologically significant. The hippocampus consolidates experiences into long-term memory during moments of conscious, unhurried attention. An achievement that is rushed past is not fully encoded. It remains, in a sense, incomplete, which is why the brain doesn't experience the satisfaction that should accompany it.
Come back to America, because the experiments that happen here are not conducted by enemies or wartime adversaries. They are conducted by the government of a nation that has just fought a war, in part against the idea that certain human beings can be used as objects. The irony is almost unbearable. At the Fanal State School in Massachusetts, a school for intellectually disabled children, an experiment is conducted in the late 1940s and early 1950s. With funding from the Atomic Energy Commission and the Quaker Oats Company. Researchers want to study how the body absorbs nutrients from breakfast cereal. To do so, they feed radioactive iron and calcium to children, mostly boys, who are residents of the school. The children are not told they are being given radioactive materials. Their parents are told they are joining a science club that will provide extra meals and field trips. The consent forms do not mention radiation. The boys range in age from 10 to 17. They are already among the most vulnerable people in American society. Children with intellectual disabilities, largely cut off from their families, entirely dependent on the adults who control their environment. At Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, between 1945 and 1947, more than 800 pregnant women attending prenatal clinics are given radioactive iron in a drink they are told is a vitamin cocktail. The experiment is funded by the federal government. The women are not told about the radioactive content. Some of their children are later found to have elevated rates of cancer at the Cincinnati General Hospital between 1960 and 1971. A series of experiments funded by the Department of Defense exposes cancer patients to whole-body radiation at doses far exceeding normal therapeutic levels. The patients, many of them poor and black, are not fully informed about the experimental nature of the treatment or its purpose, which is not primarily therapeutic. It is to study the effects of radiation exposure on military personnel. Some patients receive radiation doses equivalent to what a soldier might receive near a nuclear blast. The researchers are studying how long a soldier could continue to function after nuclear exposure. He patients in the hospital beds are the stand-ins for those soldiers. At least 8 patients die of radiation poisoning.
3 minutes of unhurried attention is enough to complete what hours of rushing past never will. A real-life example. Someone who receives significant recognition at work and immediately begins listing what they should have done better, before the conversation about the recognition has even ended. Their brain never closes the loop. The achievement adds no weight to their sense of self-worth because it was never fully received. When they practice pausing, even briefly, even imperfectly, something accumulates over time that rushing never allows. The fourth step is relocating the source. This is the deepest one. The emptiness that follows achievement is, at its root, Information about where you have been trying to source something that cannot come from outcomes. The sense of being enough, of being safe, of mattering. These are not things that achievements deliver. They are states that are either cultivated internally through the relationship you build with your own experience over time, or they remain permanently on the other side of the next goal. The brain is plastic. It learns what it is repeatedly shown. If it is repeatedly shown that the source of okayness is external, a number, a title, a person's approval, it builds its architecture around external scanning. If it is repeatedly shown that the source of okayness can be accessed from within, through the quality of attention you bring to your own experience, through the recognition of what is already present, rather than what is still absent, it begins slowly to build a different architecture. This is the work underneath the goal work, and it is the only work that eventually ends the cycle of arrival and emptiness. A real-life example, someone who has achieved, by any external measure, a significant amount, and who has felt the emptiness at every arrival, begins a single practice. Once each day, not in a moment of achievement, but in an ordinary moment, they ask, "Is there anything here, right now, that is okay?" Not perfect, not what they were working toward. Just okay. The answers are small at first. The light in the morning. The fact that their body is functional. The coffee. Over months, as something shifts, not in their circumstances, but in the baseline from which they encounter their circumstances, the goalpost doesn't disappear, but it stops carrying the full weight of their sense of self. Here is the model that holds everything. The emptiness you feel when you finally get what you want is not evidence that you are broken. It is evidence that you have been using the future as a storage unit for a feeling that can only be accessed in the present. The brain's anticipatory system generates a simulation of arrival that is always more complete than any actual arrival can be. The dopamine of pursuit sustains a sense of aliveness that the achievement itself cannot maintain. And the emotional target underneath the goal, the safety, the enoughness, the sense of finally, is not location dependent. It never was. The path through this is not to stop wanting things. It is to name what you're actually looking for beneath the thing you're pursuing. To invest in the process itself rather than only in the destination. To actually arrive at the arrivals you reach rather than rushing past them. And slowly, imperfectly, to begin sourcing the thing you've been looking for from a place that outcomes, however real, however earned, were never designed to provide. The emptiness after arrival is not telling you that you are too broken to be happy. It is telling you that you have been trying to buy something with a currency it doesn't accept. And now you know what currency it actually takes. Not achievement, not arrival, not the next thing or the one after that. Just this, practiced imperfectly, in the only moment that has ever been available to you. The present one. That is where the thing you've been looking for has always been waiting.
The exposure of these programs begins not with government transparency, but with the persistence of journalists, historians, and survivors who refuse to accept official silence as a final answer. In 1986, a congressional subcommittee report reveals the scope of government radiation experiments on unwitting citizens. In 1993, journalist Eileen Wellsome publishes a series of articles for the Albuquerque Tribune, documenting experiments in which ill patients were injected with plutonium without their knowledge. The series wins the Pulitzer Prize. It forces a national reckoning. President Clinton establishes the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments in 1994. The committee reviews nearly 4,000 reports and finds that the government sponsored hundreds of experiments involving thousands of unwitting subjects over several decades. The final report acknowledges that these experiments were wrong. That informed consent was not obtained. that the subjects were not told the truth about what was being done to them. The report is thorough. It is honest. It is, in many ways, a remarkable act of institutional self-examination. And then, largely, life goes on. There are no criminal prosecutions. The researchers, most of whom are dead by the time the report is issued, face no legal consequences. The surviving victims and their families receive acknowledgement, and in some cases financial settlements. But the amounts are modest, and the process is slow and adversarial. What the report cannot do, what no government report can do, is give back what was taken. The health of the pregnant women at Vanderbilt, the years of the children at the lives of the patients in Cincinnati. These things exist in the past, beyond the reach of apology. There is a thread that runs through every experiment in this documentary. It is not cruelty, exactly, though cruelty is present in abundance. It is something more specific. It is the decision made at some point before the experiment begins, that the person who will be subjected to it has a lower claim on moral consideration than the knowledge the experiment might produce. That decision is never made publicly. It is never announced or debated. It happens quietly, in the framing of a research proposal, in the selection of a subject pool, in the language of a consent form that obscures more than it reveals. It happens when a researcher looks at a prisoner or a patient or a child in an institution and sees not a person with a future and a history and relationships and rights, but a variable, a data point, a means to an end. This is not a historical pathology. It is a human one, and it does not require extraordinary wickedness to produce it. It requires ordinary people, placed in systems that have already made the dehumanizing decision for them, following the logic of those systems to its conclusion. That is, in some ways, the most frightening thing about this history. Not that monsters existed, but that the damage was done mostly by people who would not have described themselves as monsters at all. People who went home at the end of the day, who had dinner with their families, who slept without apparent difficulty, who believed, or told themselves they believed, that what they were doing was necessary. The experiments in this documentary were designed, in many cases, to produce no survivors, or to produce survivors who would never speak, who were too damaged or too discredited or too frightened to tell what had been done to them. The architects of these programs understood that their work could not withstand public scrutiny, so they built systems to prevent that scrutiny from ever arriving. They almost succeeded. In some cases, for decades, they did succeed. But the truth has a peculiar durability. It survives in the testimony of people who were told no one would believe them. It survives in documents that were misfiled or overlooked or carried out of a building in someone's coat pocket. It survives in the bodies of survivors who carry the physical evidence of what was done to them into old age, into the presence of doctors who eventually ask the right questions. It survives because the people who experienced it survived. Some of them, not all, but some. And those who survived did something remarkable. They talked. Not always immediately. Not always to people who wanted to listen, but eventually, persistently, across decades, and against official silence and institutional denial, they talked. Their voices are why we know what we know. Their testimony is why these programs have names now, why they appear in congressional reports and history books and documentaries. Their refusal to accept that what happened to them would go unacknowledged is the reason you are hearing this story right now. The experiments were designed to produce no survivors, but the survivors are still here, and they are still speaking.